Well, good afternoon. Welcome back to those of you who've joined us before, and a very warm welcome if you're new to our lunchtime webinars, which are part of a series on the impact of COVID-19 on churches and charities. My name is Jackie Fletcher, and I lead our Treasurer Services here at Stewardship. In these webinars, we aim to address the challenges ahead as we navigate our way through COVID-19. And we're here today to bring you an update on employment issues. Now, it's been 3 months since we first went into lockdown, and at the time it was difficult to imagine what life would look like today. The various challenges that we've faced over the last few months are still evolving, as indeed is the government's furlough scheme. So we thought that now would be a really good time to address some of the longer term issues of employment. We'll include a review of the changes to the furlough scheme as well. So I'm delighted to be joined today by Mark Jones, who's Head of Employment at Edward Connor Solicitors, and his associate, Jemma Herrick. And I'll give them a moment to introduce themselves to you very shortly. So if any of you are new to Stewardship, then let me explain our vision, which is for the world to encounter Jesus through the generosity of his church. And we do this in a number of ways, but the purpose of this call is to strengthen Christian causes. We're all here because we want to reflect Christ's love to those both within and outside of our organisations at a time where there's so much uncertainty. And we want to do that with confidence and integrity, and without stepping over any legal lines or compromising our witness. So as we start our webinar today, we pray that you will feel equipped and encouraged as we consider the issues in front of us, and that the words we speak, the answers we give, and the resources we share will be a great support to you as you serve within your church or charity to the glory of God. Amen. Now, it's my joy and delight to formally welcome our panellists, Mark Jones and Jemma Herrick. I wonder if you would both just say a few words to introduce yourselves and maybe tell us a bit about Edward Connor Solicitors, as you have a rather unusual background for a law firm.
Thanks, Jackie. So I shall head up. So I'm Mark Jones. As Jackie said, I'm head of the employment department at Edward Connor Solicitors. Yes, so Edward Connor, for those who don't know, just to explain, we were set up actually in order to specifically address the need for Christian organisations to get specialist advice from qualified lawyers. So at Edward Connor, we are set up uniquely as a charity with Christian charitable objects. So we specialise in advising the Christian sector. Indeed, that is all we do. And our charity status also means that we're not about making a profit. And so we look to areas where do we think it can make a real difference to have a Christian lawyer advising. So advising not just into what the law says, but helping organisations to think biblically about these issues and pastorally. And the key areas where we work in mental health and employment, charity, and property matters. So that's the firm as a whole. But Jemma and we are very much employment law specialists. So if anybody has any questions about charity law, property law, or anything else, don't ask us. Jemma, anything you'd like to add?
Not too much, no. I work with Mark. I'm a solicitor in the employment team. And we just really enjoy serving the churches and Christian organisations in the work that we do. I'll hand back to Mark to carry on.
Thank you. So we've got a few things to cover, and we're going to break it down into a few parts. So I think probably the first area is what's going on with the furlough scheme, and hopefully make sure that those of you listening will be equipped for this. Just to flag up, I think this presentation is probably going to be recorded, but also we will be referring to some materials that are online and accessible, and I think some of those materials may be either distributed or linked to on the Stewardship website. So whilst you may feel you want to write down every word that we say, if you do miss something, if the phone rings or you have to have a call of nature, you may well be able to pick it up later on and not miss out too much. So the first part is me. I'm going to be speaking about what's going on with the furlough scheme, and we're very happy to take questions as we go along. If there is something you want to ask, please type it into the chat section, addressing your question to all panelists, and then we can try and weave it in as we go along. We have already had some questions, and we will do our best to address those as we go through. So the furlough scheme, this is in connection with the government's coronavirus job retention scheme, designed to support organisations struggling from the impact of coronavirus. And overall, I'd say it's been a broad success. There are certainly organisations who are operational now who would not be had those funds would not have been available. But there have been some examples of it being abused as well. And I think on the current figures, we've got about 2,000 reports that were made to the whistleblowing line complaining about fraud on behalf of employing organisations. If you're listening to this seminar and you haven't yet furloughed anybody, I'm afraid this first part is not going to be of much use to you, because there was a deadline of the 10th of June, and if you haven't furloughed somebody for a period of 3 weeks by the end of June, then you are not able to take advantage of the scheme at all. And so the 10th of June was effectively a deadline, the last period of time where you could furlough somebody for 3 weeks before the scheme is closed to new people. But although the scheme was originally supposed to end in May and then extended to June, it's now been extended further to the 31st of October, albeit that there have been some changes to that.
So Mark, what are the changes?
So with it being extended to the end of October, there are probably sort of two key changes here. First one kicks in from the 1st of July, that it is going to be possible to work and be furloughed for part of the time as well. So before, it was fairly linear. You had to be furloughed for a period of time, a minimum 3 weeks. You couldn't do any work during that period. You couldn't come off furlough, do any work, but we've now been made into a much more flexible arrangement. So you don't need to be furloughed for a minimum period of time. You can be on furlough, leave for a few days, work for a few days, go back on furlough leave for a few days as well. So that's the first major change from July. So the idea is supposed to be helping, easing people back to the workplace and organisations to carry on. The second aspect is financially. The government's contribution is going to be diminishing over time. So from the 1st of August, whereas there was a contribution towards employers' pension contributions and employers' national insurance contributions, that will end from the 1st of from the 1st of August. And then from the 1st of September, the government contribution, which is currently 80% of what's assessed as being normal pay, or £2,500, whichever is less, that's going to be reduced so that the employer will still have to ensure that at least that amount is paid, but at least 1/8 of that must be paid by the employer. And then in October, it will need to be at least 2/8 of that amount. So the contribution will be going down, with the employee still receiving the same amount. There are also some practical changes the way you claim to, as well as the period you claim for. As I say, the claim period is the number of days you're making a claim for. And for the period up to the 30th of June, it's a minimum period of 3 weeks. So your employer would have to be furloughed for that minimum 3-week period in order for you to be able to put in a financial claim for them. But from the 1st of July, provided there's an arrangement that's been in place at least a week, the claim period can be just for that week as well. So what that would mean in practice, as a worked example, so the period at the end of June, so if you've got somebody who's furloughed at the moment, and the period at the end of June, that is a separate claim that has to be made, and that claim must be submitted by the 31st of July. The next claim period, that can't be for any period before the 1st of July. So see the 30th of June as being a cut-off date. And then for the period thereafter, it has to be for whole calendar. You can only make claims for within 1 calendar month. So you won't be able to make a claim that spans July and August. It will need to be for either the 1st to the 31st of July, or from the 1st of July to the 15th of July, 16th of July to the 31st, and so on. You will be able to make more than one claim in a month, but not for an overlapping period. So if you've submitted a claim for 2 employees for the period from the 1st to the 16th of July, and you then got 2 other employees, you won't be able to claim for them for the period from the 14th to the 16th, but you can claim for all of the employees for the period 17th of July onwards. As I say, these claim periods must cover at least 7 days. There is one exception, which is if it's at the beginning or the end of a month, and the preceding period added up to it makes at least 7 days. So as I say, the claim can't span another calendar month. So if you were putting a claim on the 29th of July, you've then got obviously the 2 days, 30th and 31st of July. And as the person had been furloughed beforehand, so you've got at least a 7-day period, including the 30th and 31st of July, you'd be able to make a separate claim for that July period. You can see one query we've got in, actually speak to one query we've got in now. So what about a person you've got who wants to work one day a week as of July, and then furlough for the rest? I mean, in that case, they would only be furloughed for, I suppose, in practice, 4 to 5 days that month, not 7. So does that cause a problem? Thing to understand here is that although the what's called this flexible furlough arrangement needs to be in place for 7 days, it doesn't appear that the employee has to be furloughed for 7 full days, let alone 7 full days on the trot. So if your employee agrees to a flexible furlough arrangement, meaning they spend some time at furlough, some time at work for the whole period from 1st of July to 31st of October, and they are only furloughed for 1 day during that arrangement, so let's say 1st of July or 15th of July, just furloughed for 1 day, a claim can still be made for that July period for that one employee. Now, the guidance isn't totally clear on that, but the reason I've reached that conclusion is there was an announcement from Rishi Sunak on the 3rd of June where he talked about it. Any furlough arrangement agreed between employer and employee reported in the claim to HMRC, that must cover a period of at least 1 week. So it's the need for the furlough arrangement as opposed to things like the overarching arrangement, as opposed to the individual being furloughed for a consistent 7 days or for a total of 7 days. So that's how I expect it to work in practice.
And can employees who are on furlough just be kept on furlough?
Yes and no. Some of it depends on what agreement was entered into to start off with. At this point, I can sit back sort of slightly, Edward Connor, we can sit back slightly smug actually, because the precedent we created, the furlough agreement, actually anticipated this and covered it off. The ability that when the law changed and relaxed, that people could be required to come back and work part-time and then be furloughed again. But I think not everybody will have an agreement like that in place. And I think if you've got an agreement that has a fixed end date, certainly the 30th of June, or that doesn't envisage the person being able to work flexibly, be able to do some work during this umbrella furlough arrangement, then you should enter into a new agreement with staff. And that agreement can either be sort of periodic, I suppose, in the times you want them to do it, but bear in mind what I've said about the way payments are claimed. I think it's much better and far less paperwork, frankly, to have an overarching agreement covering a period as long as you can, ideally from the 1st of July to the 31st of October, and then giving each individual employee, staff member, guidance within that as to actually these are the days we might require you to work, and also keep them updated so people can successfully plan their lives around what works for the organisation. And in terms of a continuous arrangement, also just to repeat the point, that you still need to make a separate claim for June and July, even if you're furloughed continuously through that one period. Somebody's asked a question, like, will there be a template new agreement that might be available to use in individual churches? We do have a template agreement at Edward Connor, although that's not something that we're going to put on our website for public consumption and for free. But what I would say is, if you want to contact us, we will see what we can do to help. Our aim is, we do want to resource and equip churches and Christian charities and do that in a way that is cost effective.
So if we want to use the scheme, what are the key steps that we should be taking now?
Well, if you've not if you're not already furloughed, somebody say by the 10th of June, then you've missed the deadline. Don't worry about doing anything. Don't worry about doing anything now. You can go and get a cup of tea for the next 10 minutes of me jabbering on. But I think if you are wanting to take advantage of it and you're able to make staff aware, keep them informed what's going on. So make them aware that the scheme is changing, that it's carrying on for a further period, that you plan to take advantage of it. Why? Engage them in the process so they can be informed. And then get agreements in place, obviously, with employees understanding this is what's going to be happening going forward, this is what we need your agreement to, and why. And I anticipate that most employees will understand, and particularly if it's not going to have an impact on what they receive in their pocket, then there seems little reason why they would be reluctant to agree to it. Second thing is to, I suppose, look at what happens in practice. Check your current claim dates. Make sure you're able to work to the new regime. So make sure you're set up that you can claim for the period up to the 30th of June. And after that you're able to claim in a way that will cover off any periods of furlough up to the end of each month. For example, if you do it connected with your payroll and your payroll is paid at the middle of every month, you're at risk of missing out on the second half. So you might have a process in place that mocks up that second half from the end of that, up to the end of that calendar month. Now, what may help with that is know that when you submit a claim, in fact, the claims can be made up to 14 days before the end of the month, for the entire month, if you have clarity about what hours you're going to require from the people who are flexibly furloughed. So if, I know Bert is working for you under flexible furlough arrangement, 17th of July, you know how many hours you're going to need for the end of the month. 17th of July, if you put in your claim, you will be able to cover off the whole of the month within that period. Just going to pick up very quickly, another quick question is just flitted past somebody saying they've got to know somebody who's on furlough, who's being paid less than minimum 80% amount. There is a hotline for that is an abuse of the system. So that would actually make it about 2001 complaints. There is ability to report concerns about the misuse of the system, but also that individual may have a remedy, because as it's not lawful to do it, they cannot lawfully agree to it, and they may have a claim for unlawful deductions from wages. They ought to go and get individual legal advice, and I would encourage them to do so. Now, Edward Connor, we only act for organisations, we can't advise individuals, but do get that advice. If you want a Christian lawyer, you don't just have to use Edward Connor, and if you're an individual, say we can't have. There's an organisation called the Lawyers Christian Fellowship. I was, up until yesterday, chairman of the charity, stepped down after 7 years, but their website has got a Find a Lawyer web page where you can put in your issue, where you are, and he'll send it around to Christian lawyers who are known to the Lawyers Christian Fellowship, who will then come back and be able to assist you. And it also has details of Christian law firms that you may be able to contact direct as well.
Thanks, Mark. We've had a few questions coming in around pay. So what should we pay people who are flexibly furloughed and working part of the week and furloughed for the rest?
Yeah, and this is a really tricky. I mean, to go into this and probably actually take up the whole of the session, which I'm loath to do, and I suspect people wouldn't thank me for. On the days that you work, you're entitled to your normal pay, whatever the contract says or whatever has been agreed. For the periods that somebody is furloughed, you do a calculation that's similar to that you've already done on your previous claims up till now. So you would, you need to know their normal average hours. So if somebody's working fixed hours, you look at their fixed hours, the last pay period that ended for the 19th of March, ignoring any periods of leave, divide by calendar days, multiply by the number of calendar days in the pay period, and round that up. It's a bit trickier for those on variable. On variable pay, you look either at the hours that they've worked in the last tax year, or the equivalent month of the last tax year, if that happens to be higher. What I say is actually that there's quite a lot of guidance on the government web pages to do this, and I would probably say sort of having a look at that. But it is complicated, and so whether it's Stewardship or whoever do help you with your payroll, please give them the data in good time. This is already causing, I know, a number of organisations a massive headache. They give them time, as well as, well, I might suggest put some tea, biscuits, and maybe a damp towel to wrap around their head as they do the calculations, because it's not straightforward, but the information is there.
Just picking up on a question that we've had in, someone's asking, we have staff who are paid the same amount each month, but they don't work the whole year, so it's a long summer break. Can they be furloughed during this period when they wouldn't normally be working? Is it right to use the scheme morally, and can they use the scheme?
This is, yes is the short answer, slightly longer answer. I think where you get there depends partly upon whether we're talking about a periodic contract here, i.e. one where there's gaps between employment, so somebody who's a seasonal employee, if you like, picks fruit in the summer and then has a new contract next summer to go and pick more fruit, or whether the person is employed but not required to work through that period, like a teacher may sort of just actually during the summer period. Sometimes it's treated as holiday, sometimes it's a period where they're not required to work. So I say it's the way you get there is slightly different, but if they're employed during that period, so like I suppose the teaching situation, yes, and it is in line with the purposes of the scheme, provided you're affected by coronavirus. So if, let's say, for example, you've not been able to work part of the year for the, let's say, February through to April, or February through to May, you've not been able to work because of your income as an organisation has been impacted by coronavirus. Normally that income would sustain you to pay your staff through the fallow period when they're not working during the summer break. You haven't had that income to sustain them. So it seems to me that would be entirely appropriate use of the scheme. If it's a periodic contract, so employed some at the time and then employment ends, a new contract, effectively that's a fixed term contract that would have ended. The scheme also covers this and allows you to retain somebody on beyond the fixed term contract so they can benefit. You just agree an extension of that fixed term. Now, if their employment ended, you could not claim for the money for the following months after it ended. So if it is a periodic contract and it ends, then wouldn't be appropriate after employment has ended to continue making a claim under the scheme, even if you're going to have to keep on paying them for those non-working periods. But I appreciate actually, I mean, this whole thing sounds quite odd, and so from a moral perspective, you might be saying, well, is this right? But these are the situations the scheme was expressly designed to cover. So I'm comfortable that it would be appropriate, and it's supporting employees, it's helping to keep the organisation in a good economic shape, which will hopefully preserve everybody's job.
I'm just having a look at some of the other questions we've got coming in, and there've been a couple of questions.
Flying in, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. A few questions around annual leave. So, for example, if you want to get somebody who's on furlough back flexibly in July and August, but they've got annual leave booked for August, how do you treat that? What does that have cost implication wise?
Okay, well, if somebody's on annual leave, you can just decide whether you normally position you'd honour that. They go off on their annual leave. There can still be an umbrella furlough arrangement in place whilst they're going off on that umbrella leave, so you can get to agree something for the 1st of July going onwards. Staff will still be able to take holiday just like they are at the moment during the current scheme as operation. If it's not convenient for that staff member to take that holiday, in theory, the employer can approach the staff member and say, actually, would you mind not going on holiday? If the employee hasn't invested too much money, they may be amenable to that. Where they do go off on holiday, I suppose an important point to flag up is their entitlement to pay is full pay whilst on holiday. Even if you're only paying 80% under the scheme, they get their full pay. I'm just going to say, actually, see we've got one other question come in as well. If we've got an employee, are we at risk if we offer a more generous notice period to somebody who's furloughing than we would normally give? Is that appropriate? So, for example, we've got somebody who, let's say they're on a month's notice, and rather than giving them a month's notice, we give them 3 months' notice, because that enables them to remain employed for a bit longer and receiving the benefit of the scheme. Again, that it may seem unusual, but that is within the spirit of the scheme. It's the sort of thing it's intended to cover, to reduce the periods of unemployment. What the government has basically set up under the scheme, it's almost using the employees as an agency for paying a benefit. So if you've got an employee who you know you're not going to have any use for, and their employment is going to end, rather than them being dismissed and then seeking to get state support or whatever they need, that support is being paid by you through, whether it's through an extended notice period or by keeping them employed for longer before you give them the notice that is inevitable. Either of those, I think, are still completely appropriate.
I've got another one asking if you've got somebody who's furloughed at the moment, would you be able to get them in for an hour or two? I've had another question actually on training as well. So if you're not asking them to come back to work, but you want to get them in effectively to assess how many hours they'd need to do when they came back in July, is that possible?
Yes, you can't require your staff to work. I don't think that's probably really comes under the description of training. What we do know is that you can't require staff to work, but that doesn't mean you can't be in contact with them, in communication with them. Say, actually, is there anything that we can do to help you to come, help you to come back on these dates when we're expecting you to come back? But we need to avoid abusing that. Or asking somebody to help that's in a way that's more like a handover. That is working. Asking somebody to do a training course that might benefit them when they come back to work, that would be okay. But asking somebody to come in and do a lot of data entry so then everything is nice and smooth when everybody else comes back, again, that would be inappropriate. I suppose the golden rule is to think, is this something we are requiring? Is it the employee working for us? And if it's training, so it's not working for you, it's still providing some service to you as an organisation or some financial benefit. There's a bit more detail on this, I should say, within the handout that we produced, which is accessible on the through the Stewardship website. I'm good. What I'll do, I'm just going to, because time is zipping on, we'll try and wrap up some of the questions that we can, any space at the end, but I want to, I think there's an issue I know is concerned a few people. I'll try and wrap that all in one about what happens if you've got somebody that we want to come back under a flexible furlough arrangement or not, but actually they're concerned, they're a bit scared to come back for whatever reason. What can we do? I can only give general advice obviously to that position, but I would say try and get individual advice because the circumstances are manifold in that, and so the potential answers are varied as well. I suppose the primary question is, can you assist when they're coming back and what do they get paid? You have an obligation as an employer to look after the health, safety and welfare of your staff. So firstly, can they work from home? If they can work from home, fine, they get their normal pay. Even if they're too scared to come back to work, doesn't matter, they're still able to do their job, they should be paid. If they can't work from home and they can't come in, they're too scared to come in, well, it depends. You've got a contract, that contract specifies a place of work and the job they need to do. If the employee is not prepared to do the work the contract requires them, then unless there's some good reason for that refusal, the employer doesn't have to pay the wages that the contract requires. You don't work the hours, you don't get the pay. So what are the reasons? Are they reasonable? So this word, I'm afraid, that keeps lawyers in a living. Reasonable covers a whole range of things. If they were unable to work within social distancing, well, then that may be perfectly reasonable to say, well, no, I'm not going to come in. I'm not prepared to put my health at risk in this way. Now, we've just had, for those Boris has just announced, we have the social distancing reduced from 2 meters to 1 meter, but I don't think he said when it's going to happen. But that may be one way of addressing that in employees' consents. When the law changes on that, say, actually, you think we can do it now, it's 2 meters, 1 meter, you don't need to be quite so scared. I say it's sensible for the employer to do a coronavirus risk assessment of the workplace. And indeed, if you employ at least 50 staff, there's an expectation, government expectation, that you will be doing this risk assessment. And it's still sensible in any event for those are less people. Identify risks in the workplace and reduce it so that any concerns people have, any fear, it can be shown to be actually unreasonable or misplaced. Best way of getting them back to work. Look at things like staggering working hours so you don't have too many people in the workplace at the same time. Also, their commute means that they can avoid public transport and driving maybe more of an option. Look at providing protective equipment, sanitizers. Maybe ask staff to say, actually, where we can't do social distancing, wear face covering, double up your cleaning rotas, and keep staff aware of this, and actually provide a way in which staff can raise their concerns would be appropriate as well. There are going to be people, though, still for whom the risk is going to be greater and for whom it would be more reasonable for them to refuse to come in. So if you've got staff who are pregnant, I say staff, women, let's not be shy. We're not going to fall into the trap of forgetting the people who can get pregnant. Women who are pregnant, or indeed those who are clinically extremely vulnerable. So you as an employer, you have to act reasonably. If you don't, you are in breach of the contract, and you can't insist the employee honours a contract that you yourself are in breach of. So, but let's say you've done that, you think you're acting reasonably, the employee, you're not sure they're acting reasonably, what are your options? Well, if they don't come in, well, I could digress. I had a situation once when I was giving training with a chap who's in charge of a large business whose approach was not coronavirus situation, but where there had to be a business closed down. He said, right, and there'd been issues with sickness absence, right? Everybody needs to come in on the Monday. If you don't come into work, you're going to be sacked. That's equality. We're treating everybody the same. There can't be any discrimination there whatsoever. Okay, it doesn't quite work that way. Requiring everybody to work, everybody to come in, may be discriminatory on grounds of pregnancy, disability, potentially even age, because people will be more vulnerable than others. And also, if somebody won't come in because they genuinely have a reasonable belief that there is some serious and imminent risk to their health, then it's actually unlawful for you to subject them to any detriment as a result. Whether or not their belief is well-founded, it could be completely wrong. They may think there's a risk that isn't there. And also somebody raising a wider concern, not just about their health by coming in, but saying you're not following proper practices. So the example somebody raised earlier on is similar to that about their friend not being paid properly, raising a public concern about treatment of others, unlawful behaviour, putting health and safety at risk. That qualifies as a whistleblowing issue. And again, a person shouldn't be subjected to any detriment for doing that. So, but think about the options. As Christian employers, we want to act honourably. There are various other options, but rather than going sort of hammer and tongs, could you shift around their duties? Could other staff accommodate them? Could you look at flexible furlough, period of unpaid leave, maybe even get them to agree to take it as paid holiday, so that their pay isn't affected? But overall, make sure you investigate. And before doing any disciplinary along the lines of failure to comply with a lawful and reasonable management request, make sure you investigate, understand their reasons. And if at the end of the day, if they are not honouring the contract and they're not being reasonable, then there's no entitlement to pay.
Thanks, Mark. So sort of on the other side, what about an employee who wants to come back to work and the employer won't let them? Say they've got general concerns about an outbreak among staff.
Okay, so the general test here is whether is the employee willing and able to work. When an employee is willing and able and you are preventing them, so they can't work from home and you don't want them to come in because of a general risk of infection, they're entitled to their normal pay. If they're not able and willing to work, then there's no entitlement to pay, but maybe circumstances there where they get SSP, for example. So an example, I suppose, of where they might be unable to work would be, let's say track and trace requires them to self-isolate. So they need to self-isolate, they need to comply with that order, they can't come in. They probably wouldn't qualify for enhanced sick pay, but they should get statutory sick pay. If they are, but if in that situation, if there was no good reason for you saying, no, you can't come in and work, you need to pay them in full, even if they are not doing the job. I'm going to suggest that we wrap it up there, because I dare say everybody's had enough of hearing my voice. But Jackie, we've had some people asking about what stewardship might be able to do to help as well in these, what stewardship might be doing. I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yes, of course, that's a really good idea. So yes, I do recognise some of your names. Some of you are payroll bureau clients, and we are in the process this week of communicating with you what we will require from you in order to process your payroll for July. Another specific question we had, we are doing furlough claims. I'm currently on about 300, I think, since the scheme started. So we're doing furlough claims, and if we are going to continue to do them on a monthly basis, so it will match your payroll. If you have any questions about that, just contact us, but we will be communicating with you at every stage of the way to let you know what it is we're going to need from you in order to fulfill that service. Mark's already mentioned we do have a follow-up email coming out, so if you're signed up, if you receive this information, you will automatically receive that. It will have all of the resources that we've referred to today. If you haven't signed up yet, do so very quickly after the call at stewardship.org.uk/events, and then you will receive all the updates from this webinar. We also have a dedicated COVID-19 webpage on the Stewardship website. The link's on the screen. It will be in the follow-up email. And this is where we aim to share the latest advice and guidance on a growing number of issues that are affecting churches and charities at this time. There is a section on the furlough scheme, along with the fact sheet that Edward Connor have very kindly provided. And we do have a directory of available resources for churches and charities, along with guidance on financial planning, annual accounts, that kind of thing. It is updated regularly, so just bookmark it and keep coming back to it when you have questions. If you do have a more specific inquiry that is particular to your circumstance, then we do have a consultancy helpline. For a very affordable annual subscription, you'll then have access to professional consultants who can answer your questions on a range of topics, charity governance, employment, and all of those kind of things. So if you're interested in that, there will be a link in the follow-up email. I think that's enough for me, and we can now move on to our second section. I think Jemma is now going to talk about what we can do when we have no work for our employees to come back to.
Thanks, Jackie.
And sorry, Jeb, just to interrupt. While Jemma's doing that, for those who are still interested in Furlough, I'll look through the questions, and if we've got time at the end, we'll try and cover those off. So please do stay listening if you are, if that's you.
Thanks.
Great. So yeah, as a result of the last few months, lots of organisations are having to consider options for the ongoing employment of their staff. Perhaps the workload's decreased as a result of temporary workplace closures, or perhaps donations from supporters have decreased as a result of donors earning less. Inevitably, the word redundancy comes to mind, but before we consider this, redundancy should always be the last resort. There might be a way to avoid an employee losing their job while still reducing overheads. So I'd like to have a look at some of those options now. One option is to use the flexible furlough scheme, which we've covered earlier, until the end of October. Another option is to look at changing working hours. So lots of employees who have been full-time might be open to discussing part-time working options, especially after such a long time away from work and more time with the family recently. It might suit some people more, and it's certainly worth a discussion. It might not be what everybody would choose, but it may be preferable to no job at all. So initially that would require a conversation. It's informal, but you should take notes as a record. It's simply a discussion explaining that the workload has reduced and that the organisation is looking at options and putting forward some proposals for a change to working hours. If you can agree a new working pattern, there'll be no need to follow a formal redundancy process, but instead a new contract can be issued with the new working hours included. Another option is flexible working requests. So it might surprise you, but you might find that some employees are asking you if they can return to work on reduced or different hours, having now spent considerable time away from work and found a new routine. These requests need to be dealt with in a certain way. You can find guidance on this on the ACAS website if you're not familiar with how to handle them. If you can't accommodate the request, you are able to put forward alternative proposals which might suit your organisation better, but you need to be able to show that the request is being declined based on one of 8 legal grounds. There's a link in the email that's coming out to the ACAS website for anyone that needs that. Another option is sabbaticals. So some employees might be willing to take some time away from work unpaid. Whilst many people will be keen to return to work as soon as possible, this won't be the case for everyone. Those who've continued working during this time might actually be very grateful for some time away, even unpaid, to rest and recuperate after what has been for some an extremely busy time. Again, these are discussions which can be had informally, but it is important to emphasise at the outset of those discussions that no decisions have been made and the organisation simply considering options at that point in time. Ultimately, if you consider other options and none prove successful, you will be left with little choice but to consider redundancy. I won't have time in this webinar to go through all of the detail of the redundancy process. However, Edward Connor Solicitors has produced a free booklet on redundancy, which you can download from our website, which gives you a helpful overview of the process. If after reading that you decide that your organisation will need to make redundancies, we've also produced a redundancy pack which contains a wealth of information, including a timeline for the process, template letters for meetings, draft scripts for meetings and outcome letters, as well as guidance on selection criteria, all of which will guide you through the process from start to finish. But if you do need some legal support, that's also part of the package at no further cost. So today, rather than talk you through the legal redundancy process, what I thought I'd do is take the opportunity to flag up some common pitfalls and talk you through those. So redundancy arises when an employee is dismissed in one of three circumstances. Firstly, where there's an actual or intended closure of the whole business. Secondly, where there's an actual or intended closure of the business at a particular workplace. And thirdly, where there's a reduction in the need for employees to carry out work of a particular kind. So my first pitfall is relocation. So the first and the third reasons for redundancy, which I've just mentioned, might seem quite obvious. Either we're going to cease operations and therefore we won't need any more staff, or there's less work available now, so we won't need as many staff. However, the second reason isn't always as clear. The closure of a particular workplace could involve a relocation exercise where none of your staff will actually lose their jobs. However, unless there's a contractual right for an employer to move its employees from one premise to another, this would give rise to a redundancy situation, requiring the necessary levels of consultation with employees. So if some organisations have decided to let more employees work from home, for example, following lockdown, and want to now move to a smaller office, this could result in a redundancy situation, even if the new office is only down the road. So that's the first one to be mindful of. And the second pitfall I've thought of is around collective consultation. Sometimes employers forget about the separate requirements for collective consultation. This can arise where 20 or more employees are potentially at risk of being made redundant, whether or not they are actually made redundant. So the first question to ask is how many employees are potentially at risk of redundancy? If the answer is 20 or more, you will have additional obligations under the collective consultation requirements. The second situation where it can arise is where there's a recognised union or employee representative body. In that case, collective consultation obligations arise even if less than 20 employees are at risk of being made redundant. The price for failing to observe collective consultation requirements can be high, so it's something to be sure about at the outset. So the third pitfall I wanted to talk about is inadequate consultation. There are two things to mention in terms of consultation. Firstly, when do you start it? And secondly, how long should you continue to do it for until you reach a final decision? If redundancies are likely, if you know that they're likely to occur, you need to tell your staff about it. Delaying might be breaching your legal obligations to them. So you should start consultation as soon as you know there's a risk of redundancy and have informed those who are likely to be affected. Consultation involves discussion with employees about alternatives to making them redundant, so it should begin before any final decisions have been made on making particular staff redundant. A failure to properly consult would normally be an unfair process, and an unfair process would lead to an unfair dismissal where an employee has 2 years service or more. So you start consulting as soon as it's apparent that redundancy is a possibility. There'll be an initial announcement informing those who are affected that the organisation is considering redundancies and who is affected. Then you need to start to meet with each employee one by one to consult about the process and alternatives to redundancy. So in terms of how much consultation is sufficient, it is fact dependent. As a rough guide, anything less than 2 weeks is likely to be too rushed, and you should aim to have 3 consultation meetings, with any decision that someone is redundant not being confirmed before the final meeting. Clearly, there needs to be enough time between each meeting to show that thought has been given to the employee's comments and representations. At all times, you need to make sure that consultation is fair and genuine, with plenty of opportunity for employees to express their views and put forward ideas. Notes should be made at each meeting and a follow-up letter sent after the meeting confirming what's been discussed and setting a date for the next consultation meeting. My fourth pitfall is overlooking who should be in the selection pool. So part of the consultation process will involve discussing with trade union or with the trade union or an employee representative body, or with individual employees if there are no recognised bodies, the pool for selection and the selection criteria and how they will be applied. So an employer needs to be able to show that the system for choosing the pool is fair. Where they can't show this, they could lead to a finding of an unfair dismissal. Where there's more than one person, so say there's one person in a unique role, if there's more than one person who's going to be made redundant, the employer needs to consider who should be in the pool for selection. So let's say, for example, there are 10 people who carry out the same role, say 10 sales consultants, and as a result of a fall in sales, you now only need 5. Then those 10 sales consultants will all be in the selection pool, and a set of selection criteria will be applied to them to determine which 5 are most suited to the organisation's needs and which 5 will be made redundant. However, there might be another group of employees within the organisation who have a very similar skill set and whose roles could be pretty much interchangeable. Let's just say, by way of example, that's the customer service team. I'm not saying necessarily that those roles are interchangeable, but I'll just use it as an example. But if that were to be the case, then they also should be in the selection pool, as the sales consultants would rightly be able to say that even if there's a reduced need for their particular work, they could easily do the work of the customer service team. So that's often overlooked, and you need to really carefully consider other roles within the organisation when you do decide on the pool for selection, and not assume that it's just the identical roles with the same title who will be placed in the selection pool as at risk of redundancy. So my final and fifth pitfall is around suitable alternative employment, just one not to be forgotten. So another part of the consultation is to inform the employee that although their role may be redundant, every effort will be made to find them a new role. That's known as suitable alternative employment within the organisation. Please note that whilst you're obliged to consider whether there are any vacancies within the organisation, you aren't obliged to create a new role for them. If you're part of a wider group, the obligation to look for suitable alternative employment can extend to organisations in that wider group. Where alternative employment can be offered and is accepted, then there's no redundancy situation. So if the job is turned down for good reasons, the employee will still be redundant and would be entitled to their redundancy pay. If you have a vacancy that would be suitable for someone who's at risk of redundancy, you have to offer them the job, even if you believe you might find a better external candidate. So that's probably enough of me talking. I think there might have been questions coming through, Mark, as I've been talking. Do you want to ask me a few of those?
We've got one about, obviously, meeting up with people isn't straightforward. So in this time of Zoom and remote working, can we carry out redundancy process remotely?
Yes, absolutely. In ideal circumstances, you would have meetings face to face, but particularly at the moment, obviously employees might not be able to come into work, so meetings can take place remotely. Just to say, you should still take notes of the meetings and make sure that it's documented. So send letters inviting the employee to the meeting, making it clear that that meeting will take place on Zoom or Teams or whatever you use, and send a follow-up letter after the meeting as well. It would be similar, for example, with an employee who's away from work on maternity leave.
And also about people being accompanied, because the query, if they can't be accompanied by a colleague, can they be accompanied? I suppose is a question we ought to ask, but can they be accompanied by a friend or family member if a colleague can't come along?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you say, the usual, it's actually a bit confusing with redundancy. Lots of people think that employees are entitled to be accompanied to meetings or consultation meetings, there's actually no statutory right to be accompanied. But it does make sense, since it's an overall feeling of fairness and wanting to show support to the employees to let them be accompanied where they want to be. So if there's a workplace colleague, then that's great. Obviously, you'd need to ask the employee to let you know who they're bringing, especially with meetings taking place on Zoom, because we'd need to be able to set up for the workplace colleague to attend the meeting remotely as well. If they don't want a workplace colleague or want a family member or a church member or something, again, there's no legal right to it. But if you don't have a good reason to say no, then from my point of view, generally there's no harm in it. Sometimes there can be some conflicts, and if that's the case, then I'd say take some advice on whether you should let that particular person be the companion. But where possible, just to let people feel supported is generally a good thing in the redundancy consultation process.
The $64 million question, okay, how long should we consult with somebody for?
Yeah, so there's no fixed time frame. It is fact dependent, which I know isn't always that helpful, but to an extent it will depend on how many people are being made redundant. So as we said, if you're going to have consultation meetings with each employee, and generally aiming to have 3 meetings with each employee before you reach the stage of being able to confirm the decision, then obviously that's going to take time. Anything under 2 weeks is likely to be considered rushed and unfair. So as I say, it sort of depends how many people, but as a rough rule of thumb, if there aren't too many redundancies taking place, then around 2 weeks, possibly a bit longer, subject to what people might say in the meetings and whether things need looking into.
I'm going to pick up a couple of quick ones myself, and I've got one more for you. Somebody asking, can we consult with somebody whilst furloughed? Yes. So the redundancy consultation, that's not requiring them to work, so that is okay. Can you give somebody notice whilst furloughed? Again, yes. Although at that point, I'm aware of people giving legal advice saying that no, you can't. I'm confident that is wrong. So if you go through your redundancy consultation process, you need to give somebody notice of dismissal. You can do that whilst they are furloughed. But one more for you. So length of service, what used to be called sort of last in, first out LIFO or FILO, first in, last out. Is that something, a nice, safe criteria to use?
Yeah, it used to be a really popular criteria, but it's becoming less so now. It's actually can be quite damaging to an employer's skill base. It doesn't necessarily follow that the most skilled people and those most suited to the role are the people who've been there for the longest. And actually, it's becoming something that is increasingly or can be increasingly discriminatory, both in terms of age and also towards women who might have had a career break whilst taking time out to look after their children.
And just I suppose one of those thoughts on that as well. Yes, certainly I think we would say we don't use it as a sole criteria. As perhaps as a sort of a tiebreaker or as a separate consideration, that might be okay. But even better, I suppose, would be to think about what are the reasons why you might want to look at length of service. Is it because actually we want somebody who's got experience? In which case, have experience as one of your selection criteria, and that could also include experience that they've had working elsewhere, not just working for you. So pull out, I suppose, the key things, but it's no longer seen as a neutral, easy way of doing it. Although I say it was very, very popular a few decades ago, probably much longer ago than Jemma has years to her belt. I'm confident.
Thank you.
I've been pouring through. We've got a few minutes left, Jackie. Have I got a few minutes just to quickly do some machine gun answers to questions we've had?
Yes, you definitely have. We've got maybe 3 or 4 more minutes. So yeah, as many as you can get through.
Okay, buckle up, everyone. So I'm not going to cover things that are in our fact sheet, but do go grab the fact sheet. So go to the Edward Connor website. There's a free fact sheet there. There's also stuff on the Stewardship website. What about those who work and volunteer? There's advice on that in our fact sheet. Is that going to change? No, I think that situation is still going to be the same. But of course, you need to be make sure that the volunteering isn't one that's properly working. But have a look at the fact sheet, that covers that off. The how do you partially furlough? You do that by agreement, by notifying them, and that agreement, if you are going to give somebody notice of when you require and when you don't, a rota system, you ought to be telling them as part of that consultation process, they know what they're agreeing to. But it would be sensible to have an umbrella agreement that has, as part of that, we will notify you, for example, from week to week, at least a couple of days' notice when we're going to require you in and when we're not. Can we make someone work extra hours on the day that they are not furloughed in order to maximise what we get from them? It's a nice idea. No, I think that would be very much frowned upon under the scheme, even if it's not prevented by the actual letter of the scheme. There will be some tightening up, by the way, and will probably be a new Treasury direction by the time we get to the 1st of July. And I'm afraid I think that sort of practice will explicitly not be permissible. We've got 2 roles, one employer. Can they be furloughed from one or both roles? That depends. Are both roles, are they on different payrolls for the same employer? If not, if it's one payroll number but they've got 2 roles, so not 2 separate jobs, then no, they at the moment, as it stands, they would have to be furloughed completely from both roles. But of course, when it changes 1st of July, you could furlough them from one, and then they could work in the other. Can I reduce holiday for those who are furloughed? No. People accrue holiday whilst furloughed in exactly the same way, unless they've agreed not to accrue their contractual holiday to the extent that exceeds statutory holiday, but that's fairly unlikely. But what you can do is you can require people to take holiday whilst they're furloughed by giving them a proper period of notice. So it has the same effect, and that may also be a strategy that's helpful for making those who feel that they've been required to work whilst colleagues have been at home and being paid as normal, may make them feel a little bit better about the situation. Somebody's raised concern, what about those from black and minority ethnic groups who've got particular fears about coming back because of the higher rate of death? Yeah, I mean, you've got groups who are particularly at risk, and there's also, people, age is also a factor there, and men, although we haven't had too much said about us. Men are much higher risk. It doesn't necessarily mean that the higher risk because you are male or because you're a black and minority ethnic group. It may be actually to look at underlying factors, so it could be greater incidence of diabetes, for example, maybe dietary issues, lifestyle, particularly if speaking as a man, an older man. There are things to look at. You can try to address those fears. Your risk assessment. Would somebody be entitled to say, just because I am an older man or from a black and minority ethnic group, it's reasonable for me not to come into work? I think on its own, I don't think that would be sufficient. If you have done your risk assessment, you've identified the risk, you've taken proper steps to avoid it, but the position is, well, it doesn't matter what you do, because of that risk, because I'm scared I'm not going to come in. I don't think that would be sufficient. But obviously, we've still got to, you still want to approach this sympathetically, and can start to help people understand. And it may be that providing some explanation of what the law says, getting some legal advice, HR advice that you can share and be open about will help them to understand. And think about, as I say, ways you can accommodate it as well. Look at putting somebody on paid holiday instead. We've got a question about what if somebody works a half week and then furloughs for a half week for the whole month? Can we claim? Yes, but from July onwards. If the arrangement must be in place for at least 7 days, it doesn't matter if somebody isn't furloughed for a continuous period of 7 days. What's happening about training? That's not clear what's going to be happening from the 1st of July, but what I anticipate will happen is where that training is something that's required by the employer, then that will be treated as the working time. So again, you won't be able to claim a furlough payment against that. You'll need to do a calculation that treats the training that you require them to do as coming off the maximum amount you can claim for furlough. And I'll do one last one. What about a bonus for those who are not furloughed? Are we able to do that? Yes, in theory, but handle it sensitively, because yes, you may make some friends amongst those who kept working through the period, but you may also have a lot of disgruntled employees and those who are furloughed through no fault of their own. Actually, they would have loved the chance to have come in and worked, and they're being penalised twice again. So be sensitive and do think about how these things can be received. What you might want to do is to perhaps set up, do some staff consultation, maybe set up a staff group you can consult with, actually run through these ideas and see what people think. Similar to the collective consultation redundancy that Jemma was talking about. And if you get staff opinions and you do something that reflects that, even if not everybody agrees, it's going to be far more acceptable to people. I shall pause there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark, for firing through so many questions. We did have a lot, so that's great. But sadly, we have come to the end of our session today. Thanks so much to everyone for participating, sending in your questions, and apologies if we didn't get to yours. But please do look out for the follow-up email, because there will be plenty of information there, and maybe you will find the answers that you need there. It is helpful for us to get feedback, so if you want to leave a quick comment in the chat before you go, it would be really helpful for us to find out what you found helpful, and whether there's anything you'd like to see in future webinars. And so it just remains for me to say a massive thank you to our panelists, Mark and Jemma, for your generosity in sharing your time and expertise with us today. We really do appreciate it. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who's joined us on the call today. We will continue to pray for each of you and the organisations that you serve, so that you'll be both blessed and a blessing as you serve in your communities over the coming months. Bless you all. Thank you for joining us.